Why do we believe that lying is wrong? From a young age, we are taught that honesty is a fundamental virtue. We tell our children not to lie. We expect our friends, family, and leaders to tell us the truth. This deep-seated value is not merely a social convention, it is the very bedrock upon which trust is built. When someone tells a lie, they break a bond. They create a false reality for another person, manipulating their understanding of the world for their own purposes. This betrayal erodes the trust that holds our relationships and our society together. Without a shared assumption of honesty, how could we form meaningful connections or cooperate effectively? Every promise would be suspect, every statement questionable. The harm of lying extends beyond the immediate deception. It damages the fabric of social cooperation. Imagine a world where you could not trust the words of a doctor, a mechanic, or a teacher. Society would quickly become dysfunctional. The expectation of truth allows us to navigate our complex lives with a degree of certainty and security. It is this reliance on shared honesty that makes deception feel like such a profound violation. When we are lied to, we feel not only misled but also disrespected. The liar has essentially decided that we are not worthy of the truth, placing their own goals above our right to make informed decisions based on reality. This is why the default position for most of us is that lying is, and should be, wrong. Consider the simple act of making a promise. When you promise to meet a friend for coffee, you are doing more than just stating an intention. You are entering into a small social contract, one that is built entirely on trust. If you had no intention of showing up, your promise would be a lie. Your friend who trusted your word would waste their time and might feel foolish or hurt. This small example illustrates a larger principle. Our words have power, and using them to deceive undermines that power for everyone. If lying becomes common, words themselves lose their meaning. The currency of communication becomes devalued and we are all poorer for it. The instinct against lying is an instinct to protect this essential human tool. This brings us to a central question in moral philosophy. If we all agree that honesty is important, does that mean that lying is always wrong, in every single circumstance? Or are there situations where other values, such as compassion or safety, might outweigh the duty to tell the truth? This is not a simple question with an easy answer. We may feel a strong pull toward absolute honesty, but we can also imagine scenarios where a lie seems not only justified, but morally necessary. For example, what if a lie could save a life? This conflict between our duty to be truthful and our duty to care for others is where the ethical debate truly begins. How do we decide what is the right thing to do when our core values collide? For some philosophers, the answer to this dilemma is clear and absolute. The 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that lying is always wrong, regardless of the consequences. For Kant, the morality of an act is not determined by its outcome, but by the principle behind it. He believed in what he called the categorical imperative, a universal moral law that all rational beings must follow. One version of this imperative states that we should act only according to a rule that we could will to be a universal law. Could we will a world where everyone lies whenever it is convenient? Kant would say no. If everyone lied, the very concept of truth would collapse, and communication would become impossible. Therefore, lying cannot be a universal law, and it is always morally forbidden. Kant's position is strict and uncompromising. He famously considered the example of a murderer at your door asking for the location of your friend who is hiding inside your house. Even in this extreme case, Kant maintained that you must not lie. Why? Because you cannot control the consequences of your actions. You might lie and tell the murderer your friend has gone down the street, but what if, unknown to you, your friend has already slipped out the back and is, in fact, down the street? In that case, your lie would have inadvertently led the murderer directly to them. For Kant, your moral duty is to tell the truth. The consequences, however tragic, are not your moral responsibility. The act of lying itself is the moral wrong. This perspective treats the duty to be truthful as a perfect duty, one that has no exceptions. It is derived from the inherent dignity and rationality of human beings. To lie to someone is to use them as a mere means to an end. You are manipulating them and failing to respect them as a rational person, capable of making their own choices. For Kant, this is a fundamental violation of their humanity. The moral law, in his view, is not about calculating happiness or avoiding bad outcomes. It is about acting out of a sense of duty and respect for the universal moral principles that bind all of us as rational beings. Lying fails this test every single time, without exception. Many find Kant's view difficult to accept. It seems to conflict with our deeply held intuition that we should protect innocent people from harm. Does it really make sense to value an abstract principle of truth-telling over a concrete human life? Critics argue that Kant's philosophy is too rigid and fails to account for the complexities of real-world moral dilemmas. It seems to prioritize rules over people. Yet, there is something powerful in Kant's argument. He reminds us that if we start making exceptions, we may find ourselves on a slippery slope. If we can lie to save a life, can we lie to prevent a lesser harm, or to make someone feel better? Kant forces us to confront the question, once we open the door to justified lying, where do we draw the line? In direct contrast to Kant's rule-based ethics stands utilitarianism, a philosophy most famously associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. For a utilitarian, the morality of an action is determined entirely by its consequences. The right thing to do is whatever produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. This principle, often summarized as the greatest good for the greatest number, offers a very different way of thinking about the ethics of lying. From this perspective, there is nothing inherently wrong with lying itself. The only thing that matters is the outcome. If a lie produces more happiness and less suffering than the truth, then it is not only justifiable but morally required. Let's return to the example of the murderer at the door. A utilitarian would analyze the situation completely differently than Kant. They would weigh the potential outcomes. Telling the truth would almost certainly lead to the death of your friend, causing immense suffering for your friend, their loved ones, and yourself. Lying to the murderer, on the other hand, would likely save your friend's life. While the lie might cause some harm, perhaps it slightly erodes the general principle of truth-telling, this harm is minuscule compared to the immense good of saving a life. Therefore, a utilitarian would conclude without hesitation that lying is the correct and ethical choice in this situation. The decision is a matter of simple moral calculation. This consequentialist approach can be applied to many real-world scenarios. Consider a doctor who has a patient with a terminal illness. If telling the patient the full, brutal truth would send them into a deep depression and rob them of any hope in their final weeks, is it better to lie? A strict Kantian would say the doctor must tell the truth. A utilitarian, however, would ask what course of action would maximize well-being. Perhaps a white lie or a more gentle, hopeful framing of the situation would allow the patient to live their remaining days with more peace and less anguish. If the lie leads to a better overall outcome, a utilitarian would support it. The same logic can be applied to parents telling their children about Santa Claus, a lie that brings joy and wonder with very little harm. However, the utilitarian approach has its own set of problems. One major challenge is the difficulty of predicting consequences. How can we be certain that our lie will produce the best outcome? Our calculations could be wrong. A lie told with good intentions might backfire and cause unforeseen harm. Furthermore, utilitarianism can seem to justify actions that feel deeply wrong. If lying to an innocent person could produce a great deal of happiness for a large group, would that make it right? This focus on the collective good can sometimes ignore the rights and dignity of the individual. It also risks creating that slippery slope Kant warned about. If we always justify our lies by appealing to the greater good, we might find ourselves lying more and more often, eroding trust in the long run. A third way of thinking about ethics, known as virtue ethics, shifts the focus from rules or consequences to the character of the moral agent. Instead of asking what is the right rule, or what will cause the best outcome, a virtue ethicist asks, what would a virtuous person do? This approach, with roots in the philosophy of Aristotle, suggests that the goal of the moral life is to cultivate virtues like honesty, compassion, courage, and wisdom. A moral decision is one that a person with a well-developed virtuous character would make. From this perspective, lying is not judged by a rigid rule or a simple calculation, but is evaluated in the context of a situation by a person exercising practical wisdom. Virtue ethics recognizes that honesty is a crucial virtue. A good person is, by and large, a truthful person. However, it also recognizes that other virtues, such as compassion and justice, are equally important. In a situation like hiding Jewish families during the Holocaust, A virtuous person would not be paralyzed by a conflict between rules. They would see that the demand for compassion and justice in that moment is overwhelming. Lying to the Nazi soldiers is not just a calculated choice to produce a good outcome. It is an act of courage and profound human decency. A virtuous person understands that sometimes one virtue must be prioritized over another. The wisdom lies in knowing when and why. This approach helps us navigate the gray areas of daily life. How do we balance truth and kindness? When a friend asks, "Do you like my new haircut?" and you don't, what is the right response? A rigid rule follower might feel compelled to state the blunt, hurtful truth. A pure utilitarian might lie to maximize happiness. A virtue ethicist would consider what a compassionate and honest friend would do. Perhaps the answer is a gentle truth, one that is honest but delivered with kindness and tact, such as, "It's a bold new look for you." This path requires us to be mindful of our motives. Are we lying to be kind, or are we lying to avoid an uncomfortable conversation? The virtuous person acts from a place of genuine care for others. Ultimately, the question of when it is justifiable to lie has no simple answer. The different philosophical frameworks show us that this is a truly complex issue. Kant warns us of the danger of eroding trust and treating people as means to an end. Utilitarianism reminds us that consequences matter and that rules should not be followed blindly at the cost of immense suffering. Virtue ethics encourages us to cultivate the wisdom to know when compassion should temper our honesty. There is no single formula we can apply to every situation. We must weigh our duties, consider the consequences, and reflect on the kind of people we want to be. The best we can do is to approach each dilemma with careful thought, deep empathy, and a sincere desire to do the right thing.